As Welsh poet Dylan Thomas once said, film against the dying of the light. Hi, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. Today we have very little sunshine and so I am attempting to film in the midst of this. But as part of my Booker project, the thing that has been really fun for me is getting to a stage with certain decades of reading, as in reading decades of the Booker, not my own decades of reading. Where I have completed, as it were, or finished reading all of the books from a certain decade of the Booker Prize. And I've done this a couple of times, including once recently for the 2000s. And here is me doing the 1970s plus 1969. And I will say right from the jump of looking back over these shortlists, there are slightly more potential years involved here because we are looking at 1969 to 1979 because I couldn't just leave 69 by itself. And also 1970 has two different Booker Prizes, the one that happened originally in 1970 and the one that was later added on as the Lost Booker Prize. And that was because at one point the rules changed for eligibility windows for books. And so there are books that were eligible for the 1969 prize and then books that were eligible for 1970. And in between, there was almost a year's worth of books that would have fallen out of those, that essentially were big books of their time that just didn't, that would have completely had no year that they were eligible for because of the changing dates. And so as a result, there was this Lost Booker Prize that was added in. This is a long ramble for talking about that, but essentially there will be books on this list from two different 1970s, as it were. But this is me attempting to condense that decade down into 12 books that I really greatly enjoyed and that I think represent for me some of my favourites. I've left out winners just because I think winners get their own kind of love. And this is talking about the books that maybe have gone more undiscovered from in amongst that. And particularly given that this was the 70s, many of those books are either out of print or have sort of don't necessarily have the same energy behind them. They're not kind of buzzy or new. The authors might be ones who have passed away sort of a fair while ago in some cases. And so, yeah, this is my attempt to look at some of my favourites from them. I also just want to add on as a sort of an additional caveat at the beginning of this, these are, as well as obviously being my opinions, this is also a time when the Booker was just books that were part of the Commonwealth, as it was at the time. And particularly, you don't see that many books that are from outside of the UK and Ireland or Canada at this time. And so this is a list that feels very European and very white. That is partly because there were very few other books by authors of colour and from other parts of the Commonwealth that often appeared in these lists around the time. So yeah, it does look like a very specific window into literature. I'm very aware of that. I just wanted to flag that from the jump. So yeah, there we go. With that all said, let's get started talking about the actual books themselves. And I'm going to go through in vague chronological order with these books as well. So first up, a book that is very emblematic of both my taste and the 1970s in general when it comes to the Booker Prize. This is this is William Trevor with Mrs. Eckdorf in O'Neill's Hotel. And this title is very long. Many of the other titles I will be talking about are also long. I don't know what it was with the 1970s. It seems to be a thing. But this is a really fun book for several reasons. And I think why it's very emblematic of both my taste and the Booker in these years is this is a book that is written with just a lot of joy in mind. It is a book that is in many ways a character study of various people. It's also very emblematic of my taste because this is a really absurd, silly book. And it is written by William Trevor, who I love. And he showed up in the 2000s version of this that I did as well. I think he's a fabulous writer. And this book, I think, avoids being so absurd because of how well crafted his narrative is. So the full idea is, so Mrs. Eckdorf, our titular character, is a photographer. She is in O'Neill's Hotel, and this is where we see a lot of things happening. And I think novels in hotels can be really fun and really interesting just because of how much happens in hotels. It's all of the worlds of sort of secrets, and it's this very transitory place where people get to be different versions of themselves, or where something else comes to the fore that maybe wouldn't have otherwise been there. And this is especially what we see in this book, where there's a very bawdy, silly sense of humour going through it, where there is a lot about various escapades, various sex workers and pimps, and various other things happening in amongst this book. But really, at the heart of it, as well as being a very funny and very silly book, there is something about the way that William Trevor constructs a narrative that also means that this is quite touching at times, where we are looking at the various characters, and there's an older woman who who runs the hotel, or at least owns it, and she is this slightly oddball character in the mix of all of this. And so you've just got a weird set of characters in a very weird space, a hotel, and you've got somebody who's a photographer, and in some ways I think a photographer naturally lends themselves to being a narrator or a main character in a novel because of their nature as somebody who is an outsider looking in, trying to capture details. And so there's just something really fun and engaging happening in this book, even if it's slightly balmy at times. And I feel like there was a film made of this, or maybe I'm getting confused with something else, but it's just a really fun book, but done very, very well. Next up, we have The Driver's Seat by Muriel Spark, and this is from 1970's Lost Booker Prize. And this is why I'm very, very happy that this Lost Prize exists, because that list introduced me to The Driver's Seat by Muriel Spark, a book that I have just absolutely fallen in love with. It is full of Muriel Spark's trademark kind of snarkiness, and at times bitterness and humour and silliness and lots of other things going on. But I think what's really exceptional about this book is the way that it plays around with a more typical narrative style and inverts everything. So this book is essentially billed often as a why-done-it instead of a who-done-it. So, in a typical who-done-it, a crime happens and we try to work out who has killed the person and all the details about it. The reason this is called a why-done-it is the twist of somebody dying isn't a twist anymore. From the beginning of the book, we learn that our main character will die the next day. And therefore, every character you meet in the book immediately becomes some kind of suspect, because we know that people will be talking to those characters. We know that the police will want to interrogate them. We know all of these sorts of things will be coming into the book. And so what then is delivered is an incredibly blistering 100-page novel that is going into the life of this person, some kind of degree of who might have killed her and how, and sort of building this case almost throughout the book, throwing out almost red herrings and everything else. But it is just so brilliantly done. I really enjoy Muriel Spark's work anyway, but I think this book is a particularly fun example of Muriel Spark just doing something completely wild and offbeat. It's very funny in its ways at times. We don't necessarily... It's obviously laced with the tragedy because we know someone's dying, but there is something very engaging and funny about the way that we get there. And yeah, I just really, really adore this book. Next up, moving to 1971, we have Doris Lessing with Briefing for a Descent into Hell. When I said that these were long titles in this period, here we go. But I really enjoyed this deeply. This is a book that I think is so inventive and thought-provoking. So essentially we meet a character at the beginning of the book called Charles, and he is a professor at university, and he starts to we start to learn that people around him believe him to be mad, and this becomes a thing. Everyone around him is talking about how he is losing track of reality and all of these other things. But what we then see creep in to the narrative and the way that things play around with is that he is... We see the other side of this, where he is having these huge mental adventures going on, where he is in other worlds and other planets and all these other things happening. He is in that world sane, at least it's sort of seen as sane. He is a human traveling through and observing everything that he's observing. And all of that makes complete sense. And we see in that time period, or in that way of being, that sort of space life that he has as this rich inner life, he is lucid, and the things he says mean something. It's all important and meaningful. And then when he comes back, when he is dealing with somebody who, when he's not having these sort of mental adventures, he is seen as being completely wild and sort of somebody who needs to be controlled with various drugs. And so there's something going on that's really interesting here, because he will say things that are completely relevant to the world that he's just been in. But the people who are hearing him and administering these drugs think that he's lost it. And there is something really interesting here about the ways that mental health and mental illness especially are treated, that that there is something very consistent and meaningful about what he's doing. For him, there is no separation of these two things. He has these big space adventures in his mind, and then when he tries to tell people about it, they can't understand, because he is, for all intents and purposes, speaking another language. And there's something in here that's so interesting about the way the book approaches this, of potential for mental ill health being seen through a different prism, that we are instead looking at somebody who, for him, this is entirely consistent. There is no difference between these two worlds. He is merely communicating between them. But for people trying to talk to him in English and try to understand him in his day-to-day life, he is somebody who cannot communicate what is happening in his head. And there's something really tragic and beautiful about the way the book does this that I think is just so special. And particularly thinking of how far kind of conversations around mental health and mental illness have come in the sort of 50 odd years since this book. It's really interesting to see a book that long ago deal with this topic in such an interesting and in many ways sensitive at times portrayal. I think it's a really interesting book. Next up, also from 1971, Elizabeth Taylor with Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont. Again, a long title, again, a book about a hotel. But this is a beautiful book, I think. This is the one when I said earlier that I thought Mrs. Eckdorf had been made into a film. I think I was thinking of this book. Mrs. Palfrey is an older woman. She's recently been widowed, and she moves to the Claremont Hotel to live out the end of her life. It's essentially a situation where she knows that she's not going to be around for too much longer. And so she thinks, I'm going to do so in comfort. I'm going to be around others. I'm going to have people who can look after me if I need. And she ends up meeting this cast of oddball characters who are all just there, also in many cases living out their final years. And then you have a younger man, a young writer called Ludo, who comes to the hotel and starts, he's sort of in and around, and he strikes up this really odd friendship with Mrs. Palfrey. And the friendship is this really beautiful thing where there's so much tenderness to it, whilst also obviously understanding that they are from very different generations. But there's something so tender about it, because it's a book that just allows these characters the space to be, and something that is really common, I think, in many of the shortlists from the 70s in particular, are lots of books by women that have these really beautiful character studies where we just spend a whole novel inside the head of one character and really understand the rich complexities of their inner worlds. And for Mrs. Palfrey, I think there's something so beautiful here, that we have the fact that she's widowed, the fact that she's towards the end of her life and that she's expecting to die in this hotel, but also this hotel is now full of new people who she's never really met before, and then she meets this younger man. There's a lot going on for her, and we really get to sit with her and understand the complexity of her character in a really beautiful way. And so, yeah, I think this is a really gorgeous piece of writing, and I'm really excited to actually eventually check out the film version. I can't believe I've not yet, actually. But yeah, I think there's just something so lovely about the way that we get this rare insight into this woman's life and get to spend time with her during these last moments as well, you know, her twilight years that she's spending in this hotel. Next up, moving to 1972, we have Susan Hill with The Bird of Night. And I think this is a really exquisitely done novel. Even though actually interviews with with Susan Hill suggest that she doesn't really rate her own book. She said, and I quote, "It was a book I have never rated. I don't think it works, though there are a few good things in it. I don't believe in the characters or the story." I like it, Susan Hill. But this is a book that I think is so well observed. So we have a character called Francis. He is a poet, and we see in the novel a lot of his decline around his mental health, where he is really struggling, again, kind of similar to the Doris Lessing book, to keep straight his sense of reality and irreality or unreality, whatever the word is. And he is regularly essentially a bit of a threat to himself. He is constantly wanting to end things or to act impulsively and potentially ruin everything. There's a self-destructive bent to everything that he's doing, and he is being supported by a friend, Harvey Lawson, and there is something happening in the book where there's a strong sense that Harvey feels like he can't really leave Francis. If he does, there is a very real chance that Francis will take his own life. And so it's this really oddly enmeshed friendship or companionship or whatever between these two men. And there is, at times, it feels like there's almost a romantic element to it. At least from my reading, there's almost a sense of Harvey wanting to look after his partner in this way, and Francis sometimes acknowledging that that's the case and not wanting to upset his partner, but also really fighting bigger demons and is unable to really keep on top of it. I think there's something so beautiful about this, even if the author herself didn't really think so. I think it's just so sensitively done. There is a real sense of stakes throughout this book where we do really feel that Francis regularly is on the verge of everything ending. And sometimes it's strange because you look and you realise that you've still got half the book left. So you think, well, he couldn't take his life here, could he? You know, would the book end here? How does this... There's something about the way this book is structured that I think allows you to constantly feel like you're never quite sure what's happening. I think it's so beautifully done, if a deeply sad and tragic book in its way as well. But I think it's such a, like I was saying earlier about these character studies, there's something so in-depth about the way that Susan Hill gets inside this character's head and inside Harvey's head to really think about how he is watching Francis wanting to end things, that I think is just so gorgeously done. Next up, in 1973, we have Iris Murdoch with The Black Prince. And I really enjoy Iris Murdoch's works. Her novel, The Sea, I think is a fabulous winner, one of my favourites. And there is something about the way that she writes novels that I find utterly compelling, where these are novels that are largely about characters, but also very involved with discussing philosophical concepts and building out thematic discussions around various other things. And so these are very involved novels, and very well crafted. And this book itself, The Black Prince, almost won the Booker apparently, and I agree. I think it should have. I just think it's great. The book is so wild in many ways, where we are regularly kept on the back foot, essentially about truth and what's maybe not true as well. So we meet a character right at the beginning, called Bradley. He is somebody who keeps on putting his foot in it, to put it lightly. He has affairs. He falls in love with the daughter of his main rival, and he is just... we sort of meet him as this... he always seems to fall upwards in his life. He seems to have everything kind of going wrong around him. He's not massively likable, but is also, to some degree, there's something quite endearing about how unlikable he is and how silly and whatever he is. Anyway, as the book goes on, we start to hear more and more evidence against him, essentially. This book almost feels like a trial where we learn something else from somebody else about him that makes us dislike him more, or starts to cast doubt over something else that he's told us. And so by the time we get to the book's end, we start to really have a different perception of this, that potentially we are being told a story through a character, and it's we're maybe not to trust what he says. And without spoiling anything, this book then does its own version of twisting on things, of playing around with what is true at all. Has the whole book been an additional layer of fiction on top of Iris Murdoch writing a novel? You know, it just starts to really play around with those ideas. I think this is Iris Murdoch just doing what she does so brilliantly, which is just to create an incredibly thought-provoking novel that plays around with concepts constantly. We have a real sense that Bradley doesn't know himself, really, and that other people maybe know him better, but maybe other people have a stake in not presenting him accurately. And so the whole thing starts to become this really wild thing. And again, without spoiling anything, I just think this book has such a satisfying payoff at the end, of just playing with what the whole thing that you've just read. I think it's brilliant. I think this is great. Iris Murdoch is just such a fantastic writer, and I'm so grateful from doing this book a project that it's really made me dig into a few more books of hers, because I think she had 5 or 6, if I remember off the top of my head, shortlisted for the Booker, and so she just keeps on appearing, and these are brilliant books. Next, moving to 1974, we have another regular of the Booker Prize, and that is Beryl Bainbridge. And this novel I just think is so much fun. The Bottle Factory Outing. I just love her. I love the way Beryl Bainbridge writes. She is incredibly good, I think, at capturing the nuances of conversation, the way that people actually talk to each other. Sometimes in novels, you know, it can feel like you are watching two literary concepts talk to each other rather than two people. And Beryl Bainbridge, I think, is always very good at capturing that real human quality of things, but also moving the plot along with it. So this novel is about 2 young women, Frida and Brenda, and they are in a factory that, you know, makes bottles, and hence the title. And the book starts with just sort of learning a little bit about their lives. And as the book builds, we start to learn more and more about what's happening around them. It's quite a slim book as well, so this moves along at quite a rapid pace. But what we start to see is how the dynamics of the factory start to move and change things. So these are 2 working class women. They're working in this bottle factory that is mostly run by Italian management and workers. And so they are also, for the most part, apart from being the only non-Italians really there, they're 2 of the only very few women there. So they very much stick out. And we see, and again, without spoiling anything, because I think parts of what happens in this plot are so interesting, there is there's an accident that happens that causes the rest of the novel to move along. And it becomes a bit of a mystery to try and work out some of the other details around this. And a lot of it feels very cloak and dagger. We are very much trying to find out the secrets that are being hidden in this bottle factory. And again, there's something about the way that Beryl Bainbridge plays with the mundanity of the world here that I think is so interesting, that we wouldn't necessarily think from the outset that 2 people working in a bottle factory would be the most exciting thing. But there's something about the way that she crafts this narrative that is so interesting and pacey and funny at times, whilst also being very dark, that just feels to me like the Beryl Bainbridge that I love. And I will sort of say as well, when I started doing my Booker Prize project, Beryl Bainbridge was one of the first authors who I read a lot of. So sort of Iris Murdoch, Beryl Bainbridge, a couple of others, because they'd been shortlisted so many times that I did a bit of a focused reading on them. And Beryl Bainbridge is brilliant. That was an intentional alliteration, but she is such a fabulous writer for the way that she crafts narratives, the ways that she allows characters to really be themselves in a narrative, the way that she gets inside their heads. I just think it's so fascinating, and I loved this. I think she's just brilliant. Next up, we move to 1976, and there are three authors whose books I want to talk about from this year, because I think these were some really interesting novels. The first being André Brink with An Instant in the Wind. And so he's a South African writer, and this focuses on two characters who have some kind of odd love story. And as you might expect from 1700s South Africa, particularly given the nature of this, that we have Adam, a black man, and Elizabeth, a white woman. This features some layer of complexity, to put it lightly. It's a book that is, I think, really bold, particularly for its time. I think other writers, particularly sort of black South African writers, have, I think, come along and written sort of more about this experience since. But I think for its time, this would have been a book that really opened a lot of people's eyes. So in the book, Elizabeth is, this younger white South African woman, and in many ways the book deals with the fact that she moves through the world in a very strange way. She starts the book by trying to relocate somebody who in many ways would have given her a sense of safety in this landscape. He would have been a rich, white South African man, and she would have moved seamlessly throughout the world. She is instead in the interior part of the country. She's not in a big city at this point, and this is where she meets Adam, who is who was formerly enslaved. And so what starts up is a really interesting novel about their dynamics, because she is seen as, Elizabeth has a status in this book as being protected by her whiteness that allows her access to certain places, but also being a woman on the interior, many people are nervous about that for her, and the idea that she may be victim of something pretty horrible. At the same time, Adam, as a man, has a degree of safety and security around that, but he is a black man, and as particularly also being formerly enslaved, there is a sense that he is given a certain value by the society around him that is far lower than Elizabeth is. And so what starts off is an unlikely romance, essentially, that begins between the two of them. And I think what, for me, kept this book as being a really fascinating novel and not sort of more of a throwaway romancy kind of book is the way that this book really interrogates those dynamics. At no point is Elizabeth really allowed to get away with the things that she says to Adam. She often treats him like a slave still. She asks him to pick up things and do things for her. There are a few times where she is incredibly demanding of him, and he has to remind her that he is not a slave, and particularly not hers. There are also moments where Adam is able to use or weaponize Elizabeth's whiteness to allow them into various places. But almost everybody they meet along the way immediately sees Elizabeth and thinks she needs to be rescued from Adam. And what starts to really come up then is the way that these dynamics play into everything. Elizabeth at times tries to almost deny their existence, and he has to at various points remind her about things and basically say, well, actually, do you think that these things end immediately? Do you think the fact that I'm no longer a slave changes how people see me? Do you think that race is just a thing that is colour alone? There's a whole thing that goes into everything else around this, the structures that hold up various parts of the racism that Adam experiences. And so there's something in there that I think is so interesting. It really is poking holes at this. And I think particularly for its time, this feels like an incredibly bold book for really challenging the structural element of the racism around particularly Adam. And so, yeah, I think this is a really, really fascinating book, even if it, on paper sounds more like a romance. There's something much deeper going on about the ways that it uses that romance to explore something very real to the history of South Africa. Yeah, I thought this was really intelligently observed. Next up, from the same year, we have The Doctor's Wife by Brian Moore. And I have really enjoyed the books of his that I've read as part of this project. He has a really innovative way, I think, of getting inside the heads of these characters. And we meet Sheila, who is the titular Doctor's wife, and she is... We meet her at a stage where she is in many ways tired of being a wife. There is something about it that feels incredibly suffocating for her. Not only the relationship itself, but the expectations around her. This is in Belfast, and so there is a sense that there are also big expectations of what a typical wife, particularly a doctor's wife, where you're publicly known, where, you know, the community around you know the doctor's wife is very much present, and she starts to feel incredibly hemmed in by this. And what then transpires is she starts to essentially eject herself out of that relationship, and she tries to do so in whatever way makes sense for her. And what that initially starts to look like is an affair. And she has what feels like a bit of a breakdown in the just before, or kind of some kind of crisis before meeting this man. And then when she meets this American man, she's in Paris, he's younger than her, there's a sense that she is almost having this midlife crisis of being with a younger man and hoping that this will be the new start to her life. Meanwhile, she's basically just ejected herself from the life that she had previously. So everyone around is terrified for what has happened to her. She's not really replying to anything. She's just disappeared off to Paris. She starts to have this affair and realizes that this isn't really solving it either. And so she also ejects herself from this. And there's something about the way... I'm really fascinated in novels by characters who just leave their lives, who just walk away from everything that's happening and try to start something new. There's something both seductive about the idea of it and utterly tragic about the way it actually happens. The fact that we've had to get to a stage where a character just thinks, I can't do this anymore, and entirely leaves. And the part I mentioned that has really stuck with me from both reads of the book is the ending. And again, without spoiling anything, there is something so profound about the way this book ends. So tragic, so beautiful, of this idea of what it looks like after all of this, after the aftermath of everything, is just... the image of it is burned into my head. There is a particular scene, and obviously I won't mention it. I have done my best to approximate in my mind a similar place of it. And whenever I see that similar place, I am struck by that sense of it. I think this is a really beautifully done book. And it's really tragic in the way that we watch someone essentially having some form of depression or crisis or both, you know, really happening in her life. But at the same time, a sense of renewal and the idea of what could be, this idea of stepping out of a life that doesn't work for you. I think it's so brilliantly done. It's such a psychological novel in its approach, and I really love this. Keeping in the same year, we have Julian Rathbone with Kingfisher Lives. And this is a very odd book in many ways. It's quite a slim book, quite a pacey one, and it plays around quite a bit with the idea of what it actually is. So on the surface, this book feels quite pulpy and like it's not really full of that much weight or whatever. It's a book that is very loud and silly and abrasive and all of these other things, with lots of sort of sex and violence and whatever. But something much deeper is going on really in the background of this. It's a book that basically feels a bit like sort of a Lord of the Flies style thing, where we have a set of characters who find themselves somewhat stranded, and we start to see the barbarity that comes into their lives and what happens around this. And particularly this book that starts off being this more of a romp with these sexual conquests and this sort of bravado and all of this kind of thing, very quickly becomes a book that is more haunting and full of suspense about what might happen to them, but also pokes at deeper questions about who gets to be human, what it means to be really human or moral, when actually if your human life is at risk, you might do things that feel more barbaric or whatever. And so it becomes this really odd book. Yeah, I remember reading this a couple of years ago, putting it down and being almost baffled at what I just read, but loving the journey. It's a really, it's a wild book for what it is. But also there's something very clever going on in it, I think, that pokes at the idea of um, at the kind of the veneer of civility that we put over our actions, that we'd like to think of ourselves as being a certain kind of person. And actually, you know, we might think we're really in, sort of new levels of consciousness with sex and with whatever else. And actually there's something very primal still to us that is far more animal and untamable than we would like to think when we talk about everything else. And so I think it's just a really fun book, but one that really plays with big ideas at the same time. So next we fast forward on to 1978, and we have another former winner here with Bernice Rubens with a book, A 5-Year Sentence. And I personally prefer this to her winning book, The Elected Member, although I think that book is also very good for the way it delves into the inner life of someone really struggling. In A 5-Year Sentence, we have a character called Miss Hawkins, and she lives her life very much to a schedule. She is sort of constantly keeping track of everything. She has everything planned out. And at the beginning of the book, she wants to die. And this, again, somehow very common to a lot of the books in the 70s, especially the ones that I've really enjoyed. She is determined that she's going to die later that day. She's decided it. It's part of the plan. It's in her diary. And if it's in her diary, it is real. And then and particularly she's at a stage where she's about to end a diary. And so she thinks, well, here's a perfect time of any. However, she, that day, leaves her job. And she goes out very willingly because in her mind, she's about to die. And as a leaving gift, her colleagues, knowing that she keeps a diary and is very fastidious about it, give her a 5-year diary. And she looks at that and realizes that she now can't die because she's essentially got to fill this diary, and she can't leave this diary unfilled. It feels like an affront to every sort of belief system she has. And so in many ways, she's now condemned to live. She's been told by the people around her that she's got to live for the rest of these 5 years. She now doesn't have a job, and so she essentially embarks on some form of a bucket list of what she wants to do. And she starts writing things in her diary to make them true. So she will, for example, not really feel like she can summon the courage to ask someone out on a date, but then she will write it in her diary for the next day. So say something like, you know, Monday the 23rd of March, I asked out John for a date, and now it's in the diary and she can't make that thing not true. So she does it. The next day she asks him out. And so what we will see is there were these little funny moments where sometimes she's completely contorted herself into some kind of corner because she will have written, well, I need to ask him out for a date. Oh, but actually now he's cancelled the meeting up in person, which is when I was going to ask him. So now I need to find a new way of doing the whole thing. It just becomes something like this. And in doing so, she finds all these new reasons to live. There are always now new things on the horizon that she either wants to do to put in the diary, or that she's already written in the diary and now has to make true. And I just think it's such a fun and unique way of doing the narrative part of this novel, but also just so joyous in the way it's written. It's very funny, this idea of somebody, the only reason that they're doing half this stuff is because it's in a diary that they wrote themselves. She could at any point decide not to write these things, but there's something pushing at her to keep living. And I just found it a really inventive and fun book. I just think this is great, and it was such a delight. This is, again, it's entirely the type of book that I would not have come across were it not for this project. So yeah, I really, really, really greatly enjoyed this. Last, but very much not least, we have 1979 and Praxis by Fay Weldon. And Fay Weldon is most known for her very funny writing. She is somebody who writes a lot of very tight dramas that are very funny, very silly, absurd, often pointing out the foibles of various characters, often relatively light-hearted. And Praxis feels like a very different book, but very much carrying the same DNA. So in Praxis, we follow a character called Praxis, and we see her throughout her life. And that all sounds like very common fare for a novel. But what we start to see is how, in many ways, the different parts of her life feel like they are almost entirely different characters. We have moments where she is really living a certain kind of life, and it very quickly transitions to something else. So she is somebody who in many ways is a very difficult character. She is almost uncaring in the way that she approaches various relationships, particularly sexual ones, where she is very much having sex with a lot of people, is not particularly caring about any kind of dynamic really with them. She is very much using people, moving on, all those sorts of things. But there is something still there where we get a sense of her as a character of somebody quite troubled who we want to care for and look after. We get a strong sense that she is really struggling with various parts of her life, and in some ways just needs the support of people around her. That becomes more and more complicated as it goes on, and her actions continue to be really quite horrible in many ways. But there is a strong sense that she is somebody who started off almost on the wrong foot, that she has been that life has been particularly cruel to her, that she's been dealt some very bad hands, but she's also responded to that by being almost untouchable, by being violent, by being whatever she needs to do to survive. And so I found her a really interesting and complex character to read, because she is just constantly, you would hate to meet her. You would get the sense that she'd be an absolute nightmare to have around anyone you know or love. But at the same time, you are watching her thinking that she's been really poorly treated by the people around her, and that almost the only way she knows how to respond is to be this big, larger than life figure. And so I found it really deeply moving as a book, even though in typical Fay Weldon style it's also very funny and silly and absurd. But there is something so dark at the core of this that is still so endearing. And so, yeah, I found this a really complicated novel, but in a really beautiful way. I think it's such a rare type of character where you are allowed to read them as being particularly horrible in many ways, but also understand that they are lashing out or acting out in the only ways they know. I think it's really beautifully done. And it really stuck with me when I read it, that she was just not necessarily misunderstood, because she does a lot of things that are just more objectively bad at times. But I think there is something about the nature of it that is so interesting, I think. She's allowed to be a messy character, and particularly a messy female character, in a way that we don't often see. And so I think she's really, really fabulous. I think this is a really, really interesting book, and very, very, very well observed. So that takes me to the end of these 12 books that I picked for my tops of these. I purposely went for 12 this time instead of trying to squeeze it into 10, because I learned my lesson from the 2000s. But I think it's so interesting looking back over the 70s, particularly realizing as well, because this was a time before US authors were allowed to be eligible, and many other parts of the world, it should be said as well. This is Commonwealth only at this time. There are so many books that would have been published in the 70s that are these big classics of literature that would never have been eligible for this. And it's so interesting to think about whether some of those would have crept in. In some way, there's something quite nice about it being a limited pool, and that's in some ways means that there are gems that otherwise would have gone missing. But there are also other gems that probably could have been here, but they just wouldn't have been eligible at the time. But yeah, I think it's so interesting looking back at the books from the 70s, because they really do reflect a lot of the core concerns for people in and around the time. There are a lot of conversations, a lot of books that deal more specifically with empire and colonialism and war. A lot of books that deal with changing societies, particularly with growing kind of protests and movements and everything around race and gender and sexuality and so many other things. And so it's so fascinating to see that show up in a really big way in the literature of the time as well, whilst also maintaining these very interesting character studies that I think are so brilliantly on show in these books. Of a very tight focus around one person and their inner lives and everything else. So yeah, this was a really fun part of the project for me, even though I read a lot of the 70s ones earlier on, and so it feels odd to revisit some of them many years later. I say many, like 3-4 years later, but it's also very exciting because this project is rapidly approaching the end now, which is surreal. And so at the time of filming this, I think I have 5 or 6 Booker books left, which is wild. Just the 80s and 90s left now. Very, very almost there. So yeah, very excited to continue reading these. And I'd love to hear any of your ideas from books from these shortlists that you may have loved, and or any books that weren't eligible or never came through. This is a weird one for me as well, because Penelope Fitzgerald won in 79. And although The Bookshop in 78, I think is a very good book, most of my favourites of hers came after. So I'm really excited to talk about those when we get to those moments as well. But yeah, such a treasure trove of delights for me to read a lot of these books. I hope you enjoy these or any others from the lists. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.